A life is a structure built on the breath we take for granted, until that breath becomes a rattle in the throat of a dying child. A career is a dream buried under the dust of someone else's mahogany floors. In the suffocating stillness of the Hahn estate's private nursery, where power was measured in bulletproof glass and silence, an assassination was unfolding heartbeat by heartbeat. Amara felt it in the sudden, sharp scent of almonds and the absence of a child's laughter, a dissonance in the mansion's sterile, guarded harmony. She moved through the corridors with a practiced invisibility, a ghost in a crisp black and white uniform, her presence designed to be felt only as the absence of dirt. But she was not invisible. She was merely a healer observing from a place no one thought to look. Her hands, steady as they scrubbed expensive tile, did not betray the tremor in her medical soul. She had been a ghost for 2 years, ever since the fire of her former ambitions had been extinguished, leaving her in this grayscale existence of domestic labor. Tonight, however, the red of emergency was bleeding back in, sharp and dangerous. The white lace of the headpiece felt like a leaden crown, a constant reminder of the 2 inches of fabric that separated a doctor from a ghost. Amara moved through the sprawling corridors of the Hahn estate with a rhythm born of necessity, her movements synchronized to the hum of the industrial vacuum. To the men in sleek black suits who guarded the doorways, she was merely a fixture of the house, as inanimate as the marble statues she polished. But beneath the simple black and white uniform, the mind of a surgeon remained restlessly awake, performing a silent, involuntary triage on every person she passed. As she buffed the mahogany sideboard in the grand foyer, a senior lieutenant walked by, his gait favoring the left side. Antalgic gait, her mind whispered automatically. Possible L4-L5 disc herniation, likely exacerbated by the weight of the tactical holster he wears for 14 hours a day. She kept her gaze low, focused on the swirling grain of the wood, never letting the diagnosis reach her lips. In this house, knowledge was a liability, and her survival depended on the practiced invisibility she had perfected over the last 2 years. She moved to the upstairs gallery, her cart trailing silently behind her. Through the open door of a guest suite, she caught a glimpse of a visiting associate. The man was pale, his skin possessing a distinct malar flush despite the cool air conditioning. Mitral stenosis, she noted, the symptoms catalogued with clinical precision. The slight breathlessness between sentences suggests pulmonary congestion. He's a walking emergency, and he doesn't even know it. It was a peculiar torture, seeing the molecule-by-molecule decay of the people around her and being forbidden from reaching out a hand to stop it. Her existence was now one of grayscale domesticity, a far cry from the vibrant, high-stakes world of the Lagos teaching hospital where she had once thrived. The stethoscope had been traded for a feather duster, the scalpel for a spray bottle of glass cleaner. Every day, the weight of the uniform grew heavier, a physical manifestation of the debt that had crushed her family and the accident that had extinguished her former life. She stepped into the nursery wing, the air here feeling different, heavier, more guarded. This was the sanctum of Han Jisu, the boy who represented the only innocence in a world of hushed opulence and hidden violence. As she began to wipe down the glass partitions, she caught her reflection, a tired young woman with wide eyes that suggested she was overwhelmed but determined. She looked like a maid, but behind her eyes, the healer was still there, trapped in a silent cage of her own making. Tonight, the mansion felt particularly tense, the expensive, curated harmony of the estate vibrating with an unspoken dissonance. Amara didn't know it yet, but the grayscale was about to vanish, replaced by the sharp, dangerous colors of a life she thought she had left behind. The silence of the nursery wing was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in a home, the rhythmic, mechanical shriek of a high-level security breach. Red emergency lights began to pulse, casting long, bloody shadows across the plush white carpets. The hushed opulence of the Hahn estate vanished instantly, replaced by the heavy thud of armed men taking positions in the corridors below. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Her first instinct was the one she had lived by for 2 years: stay low, stay silent, stay invisible. She dove into the nursery, the heavy reinforced door clicking shut behind her as the house's automated lockdown system engaged. The room was a fortress, a silent gilded cage designed to protect the Mafia Boss's son from the world outside. But as Amara scrambled toward the corner to hide, she realized the danger wasn't outside the walls, it was already in the room. Young Han Jisoo lay curled on the rug beside a fallen plate of artisanal cookies. His white shirt was stark against the dark floor, but it was his face that stopped Amara's breath. His skin was a terrifying shade of mottled purple, his small hands clawing at his throat. The oxygen mask that usually sat nearby was out of reach, and his breathing had slowed to a desperate, high-pitched stridor. The medical student in Amara surged to the surface, the grayscale of her maid's life burned away by the heat of a crisis. She was at his side in a second, her hands, sweaty and tear-streaked, moving with a precision that had no business belonging to a servant. She didn't see a billionaire's heir, she saw a patient in the final stages of anaphylactic shock. Cyanosis around the lips. Stridor indicating an almost completely obstructed airway. Tachycardia visible in the pulse of his neck. Her mind raced through the molecule-by-molecule collapse of his respiratory system. She checked for an EpiPen in the bedside drawer, empty. The infirmary was 3 floors down, cut off by men with guns and steel security shutters. Outside the door, the muffled sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed through the vents, but inside, the only sound was the terrifying, wet struggle for air. Amara looked at the boy's unconscious and weak form, his head resting helplessly against her shoulder as she pulled him upright. She was the only bridge between this boy and the void. To save him, she would have to stop being a ghost. She would have to risk everything on a sacrifice that no one would see coming. The nursery, once a sanctuary of hushed opulence, had become a high-stakes operating theater where the molecule-by-molecule collapse of a life was the only thing that mattered. Amara pressed her ear to the reinforced door, hearing the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots and the metallic clatter of men with guns patrolling the hallway. The infirmary, with its sterile supplies and adrenaline, was a world away, guarded by a rival clan that would sooner see the boy dead than saved. She was alone, a ghost in a crisp black and white uniform, trapped in a room of expensive toys and useless gold. Jisoo's unconscious and weak body went limp in her arms, his chest barely heaving as his airway constricted toward total closure. Amara's wide eyes scanned the room, not as a maid, but with the hyper-focused intensity of the doctor she used to be. She saw the vulnerability of the boy and the chaos around her, realizing that to remain a servant was to be an accomplice to his death. She moved with surgeon's precision, stripping the white shirt from the boy's chest. In the absence of a scalpel, she reached for a silver letter opener from the vanity, its edge sharp enough to draw blood, its handle heavy with unspoken tension. She found a plastic straw from a juice box and a bottle of high-proof hand sanitizer from her cleaning cart. This was MacGyver medicine, a bridge built from ruins. "Forgive me, Jisoo," she whispered in a voice smooth as aged scotch, though her heart was a frantic trapped bird. She sterilized the blade, her hand steady despite the tremor in her soul. She identified the cricothyroid membrane with practiced fingers, the anatomy of a deal replaced by the anatomy of survival. With one swift, cold clarity, she made the incision. The sound of the air finally rushing into his lungs was a tiny metallic cry in the silent room. She inserted the straw, securing the makeshift bridge to life just as the nursery door groaned under a heavy impact. The detonation was coming. Amara didn't move, she simply held the oxygen mask over the straw, her body language screaming sacrifice, waiting for the predator to break through the final barrier. The reinforced door of the nursery didn't just open, it disintegrated under the force of a tactical breach, the detonation finally arriving in a spray of splinters and steel. Han Seo-jun stepped through the smoke, a predator at rest no longer. His sleek black suit was dusted with white plaster, and his face was a mask of placid control that had shattered into a chillingly calm fire. In his hand, the gun was an extension of his immense power, the muzzle leveled with surgeon's precision at the center of Amara's chest. Behind him, armed men filled the doorway, their presence a silent final verdict. The scene before him was a beautifully engineered catastrophe. He saw his son, Jisoo, unconscious and weak, his white shirt stained with blood. And hovering over him was the maid, a ghost in a crisp white shirt, whose hands were stained crimson, holding a silver blade that caught the sharp and dangerous red pulse of the emergency lights. To Seo Jun, it wasn't a rescue, it was a silent assassination caught in progress. "Get away from him," Seo Jun stated, his tone like chilled steel. The click of the safety being disengaged was a tiny metallic cry in the sudden silence of the room. Amara didn't flinch. Her wide eyes met his, and for the first time in 2 years, she allowed the healer to be fully visible. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her hands were rock steady as she maintained the seal on the makeshift breathing tube. She felt the gravitational field of the room shift and pivot around the barrel of the gun, but the weight of her hidden knowledge was greater than the fear of the bullet. "If I move, he dies," she said, her voice precise and unaccented, switching to a tone of absolute competence under pressure. She didn't plead, she commanded, her body language screaming sacrifice as she shielded the boy's vulnerable form with her own. "He is in anaphylactic shock. His airway was a bridge burned before it was crossed. I have rebuilt it. Now, shut up and hold this oxygen mask." The dissonance in the room reached a deafening peak. Seojun's knuckles were white against the grip of his weapon, his eyes sharpening instantly as he processed the audacity of the servant. He looked at the surgical incision, the juicebox straw, and the rhythmic, whistling breath of his son. The moral calculus was terrifyingly simple. He saw the integrity in her gaze, the ultimate load-bearing structure of a woman who had decided to build in spite of fear. Slowly, the predator lowered his weapon, the heavy drum of the moment finally breaking as he realized the ghost was the only thing keeping his world from collapsing. The nursery was no longer a room, it was a silent gilded cage transformed into a battlefield where the only victory was a single, shallow breath. Han Seo-jun stood frozen, his immense power rendered impotent by a molecule-by-molecule biological collapse that bullets could not reach. Amara did not wait for his permission. She had decided to build in spite of fear, and in this hushed opulence, she was now the only sovereign. "Drop the gun," Amara commanded, her voice a melodic baritone hardened into a sheet of ice. She didn't look up to see if he complied, her focus was locked on the vulnerability of Jisoo's chest. "I need your hands, not your steel. If that straw shifts a millimeter, the bridge collapses and your son is gone." Seo Jun, a man whose stillness was a form of power, hesitated for a fraction of a second, a subtle shift of the air that marked the death of his dominance. Then, the weapon clattered to the marble floor, a tiny metallic cry echoing through the wreckage of the door. He knelt beside her, his sleek black suit brushing against her Maid uniform, the contrast between their worlds dissolving in the sharp and dangerous red pulse of the emergency lights. "Hold the mask," she ordered, surgeon's precision guiding her words. "Press firmly around the seal. If you feel his breath fluttering against your palm, tell me immediately. Do not move, and do not let your knuckles stay white. You need to be steady." The Mafia Boss, the predator at rest who commanded thousands, leaned in. His tense hands, usually wrapped around a trigger or a leather-bound folder, now trembled as they cupped his son's face. He was no longer the titans of industry, he was a nurse under the direction of a ghost. Amara reached into her apron, pulling out a small vial of epinephrine she had systematically liberated from the household's emergency kit weeks ago, anticipating a day of chaos. "On my count, you will tilt his head back just an inch," she murmured, her hand steady as she prepared the injection. "Now." As they worked in a silent ballet of desperation, the dissonance in the room began to fade. The armed men in the doorway watched in terrifying comprehension as their king took orders from a servant. For Amara, the grayscale existence was over. She was visible, powerful, and whole, reclaiming the integrity her father had drilled into her. The moral calculus had shifted. She had turned a beautifully engineered catastrophe into a chance for life, proving that the strongest load-bearing structure in the world was not a boss's command, but a healer's truth. The sirens of the medical evacuation team were a distant drone, a menacing drone that vibrated through the floorboards as Jisoo's breathing finally leveled into a rhythmic, life-affirming hum. The boy was stabilized, but the hushed opulence of the nursery remained a theater of sharp and dangerous tension. Amara stood, her crisp black and white uniform now a map of crimson stains, her wide eyes finally shifting from the patient to the predator standing beside her. Han Seo-jun remained on the floor, his tense hands still hovering near his son's face, a king being rendered impotent by the realization of how close he had come to losing everything. "He didn't just stumble upon those cookies, Mr. Han," Amara said, her voice a melodic baritone that cut through the expensive, curated harmony of the room. She reached down, picking up the fallen plate with a practiced invisibility that had suddenly become a form of power. She held it out to him, her hand steady as she pointed to a single, elegant drop of a clear, viscous liquid clinging to the ceramic edge. "This isn't just sugar. It's a concentrated extract, a poison administered in a single drop to ensure his throat closed before he could even cry out." The gravitational field of the room shifted and pivot as Seo-jun stood, his face a mask of placid control that began to burn with a chillingly calm fire. He looked at the plate, then turned his gaze to the doorway, where his inner circle stood in terrifying comprehension. Among them was Julian, his polished, handsome chief advisor, a man whose stillness was a form of power and whose voice was usually as smooth as aged scotch. "Julian," Seo-jun murmured, the name sounding like a tiny metallic cry in the sudden silence. "You were the one who brought the gift from the American delegation. You were the bridge between their hospitality and my son's nursery." The color drained from Julian's face, his easy confidence dissolving molecule by molecule under the heat of Seo-jun's scrutiny. He was the weak joint in the foundation, the falsified report that had nearly caused a beautifully engineered catastrophe. He had been rewriting the very soul of the house's loyalty, steering the syndicate toward a destination of his own design. Amara watched the silent assassination of Julian's reputation. She recognized the methodology, the utter lack of conscience that had once dismantled her own father's career. The ghost of her father whispered to her now, not of grief, but of integrity as the only foundation. She was no longer just a ghost or an unwilling auditor of a grand betrayal. She was the sole witness to a crime being committed in plain sight. The moral calculus was complete. The poisoned gift had been exposed, and the bridge of Julian's treachery was about to be burned. The aftermath of the red lockdown left the mansion in a state of clinical silence, the air still thick with the scent of money and deceit. While Jisoo was whisked away to a private medical wing, Han Seo-jun retreated to his study, a vast minimalist space that felt more like a courtroom than an office. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a predator at rest, but his knuckles were white as he gripped a new leather-bound folder. This was not a deal or a contract, it was a dossier on the ghost who had saved his world. Amara Okonkwo, he murmured, the name tasting like a rare vintage on his tongue. He had spent the last hour exhuming her entire professional life, and the gravitational field of his understanding was shifting. The woman who had performed MacGyver medicine with a juice box straw was not a delusional servant. She was a senior associate of the medical world, a woman who once lived in the vibrant, high-stakes environment of a Lagos teaching hospital. The investigation revealed a systematic demolition of her career, a well-orchestrated smear campaign that mirrored the acid Julian had tried to pour into the Han syndicate. Seo-jun saw the fabricated digital trail, the bribed technicians, and the mountain of debt left behind by her father's own legal battles. She had been framed for leaking sensitive data, her name and reputation dissolving under the weight of a corporate behemoth's greed. She hadn't chosen a grayscale existence out of a lack of ambition. She had been cast out of her own life, forced to disappear to be invisible just to survive. Seo Jun felt a cold fury rise within him, a feeling he reserved for those who weakened the foundations of others. Amara was a bridge builder who had been hollowed out by a lie, a casualty of the same industrial sabotage she fought every day. He looked at the digital forensics, proving her innocence, realizing that her ruin had not been a meaningless tragedy. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle. He closed the folder with a soft, deliberate click that echoed like a tiny metallic cry. He had once thought she was a weak joint in his security, but she was the ultimate load-bearing structure of integrity. The moral calculus was now clear. He didn't just owe her for his son's life, he owed her a path through the fire that had burned her. She had been merely observing from a place no one thought to look, but tonight, Seo Jun had finally decided to look. The clinical silence of the Han estate's top floor was a vast minimalist space, where the weight of the future hung in the hushed opulence of the air. Amara stood before the panoramic window, her maid uniform finally replaced by a simple, clean shift, though she still felt the ghostly presence of the lace headpiece she had discarded. Behind her, Han Seo Jun sat at his desk, the leather-bound folder containing her vindication laid open between them. He did not look like a predator now, he looked like a man who had seen a bridge being built over an abyss and was finally ready to cross it. "You have a choice, Miss Okonkwo," Seo Jun stated, his voice a melodic baritone that carried the absolute competence of a man used to shifting the gravitational field of lives. He gestured to a silver briefcase on the table, a suitcase of money that represented more wealth than her family had lost in a generation. "You can take this and disappear. I will ensure your debts are erased molecule by molecule. You can buy back your grayscale existence and find a quiet life where no one will ever look for you again." Amara looked at the money, but her mind was hyper-focused on the vulnerability she had seen in Jisoo's eyes. She felt the integrity her father had instilled in her, the ultimate load-bearing structure that refused to let her walk away from a beautifully engineered catastrophe half-fixed. "Or," Seo Jun continued, his eyes sharpening instantly as he watched her. "You stay. Not as a ghost, and certainly not as a maid. I am offering you a position as Jisoo's private medical guardian. But it is more than that. I need a secret weapon, someone who understands the architecture of a deal and the nature of the termites like Marcus Thorne. You would be my inspector on site, the one who spots the weak joint before the bridge collapses." The moral calculus was terrifyingly simple. To take the money was to remain a ghost. To stay was to step back into the light and face the fire of her former life head-on. She thought of the oxygen mask and the tiny metallic cry of the boy's first breath after her intervention. She wasn't just a witness anymore, she was a bridge builder. "I am not a victim of random corporate malice anymore, Mr. Han," Amara said, her hand steady as she turned away from the window to face him. Her wide eyes were no longer overwhelmed, but visible, powerful, and whole. "I don't want to hide. I want to finish the fight my father started. I accept your guardian's oath. I will stay, not for the money, but to ensure that no more bridges are burned in this house." The clinical grayscale existence of a servant's life had finally been extinguished, replaced by a reality so vibrant and high-stakes it felt like a homecoming. Amara stood before the mirror, but the reflection staring back was no longer a ghost in a crisp black and white uniform. She was wearing a white lab coat, the starch of the fabric a form of power that felt more like a suit of armor than a garment. The simple silver chain around her neck remained, but the weight of her father's legacy was no longer a mountain of debt, it was a foundation of unshakable integrity. The final scene was not one of hushed opulence or silent assassination, but of a sun-drenched pediatric wing in a state-of-the-art facility sponsored by Kwan Industries. Amara moved through the wards with an earned authority, her wide eyes no longer overwhelmed but visible, powerful, and whole. She was no longer merely observing from a place no one thought to look. She was the inspector on site, a bridge builder whose command of the material was absolute. She stopped at the bedside of Han Jisoo. The boy was no longer unconscious and weak, his white shirt replaced by the colorful patterns of a recovery gown. He laughed as he reached for a book, his breathing steady and deep, a rhythmic hum that was the most beautifully engineered sound Amara had ever heard. The vulnerability that had once defined him was now guarded by a fortress of medical care and a father who had learned that the strongest structures are not made of steel, but of courage. Han Seo-jun stood by the window, a predator at rest who had traded his handgun for the leather-bound folder of a philanthropist. He looked out at the city's complex network of steel and light, seeing the bridges that connected lives in a way he never had before. When he looked at Amara, there was no chillingly calm fire in his eyes, only a rare, small smile of profound, life-altering gratitude. He had saved her future not as a reward, but as a recognition of a load-bearing structure that could flex under pressure without breaking. Amara looked at her hands as she adjusted Jisoo's oxygen mask, no longer needed for survival, but kept as a reminder of the night the colors bled back in. Her hands were rock steady. They were the hands of a builder. She had crossed her own bridge from ruin to redemption, and as she walked toward the next patient, she knew she would never be a ghost again. She was the bridge to life, and her voice was finally her own.